My name is Michael O'Brien. I'm a 52-year-old anthropologist, and what I'm about to tell you happened in northern Arizona back in 1972. Even today, I get chills thinking about those 8 days in Blood Moon Valley. But I need to share this story. People should know what's really out there in those remote canyons. It all started when my wife Helen and I decided to document some newly discovered petroglyphs in a remote desert canyon. Helen's an amazing photographer, and I've spent my life studying ancient Native American cultures. It seemed like the perfect research trip. Boy, were we wrong. We borrowed our friend's 1970 Winnebago Brave, a decent RV with some cool solar panels added on. Helen thought it would be safer than camping in tents, especially in such a remote area. The drive through Arizona was beautiful. Red rocks stretching to the horizon, clear blue skies, and that peaceful desert silence. We even spotted some eagles soaring overhead. But things started feeling odd. As soon as we reached the small town near Blood Moon Valley, you know that feeling when you walk into a room and everyone stops talking? That's how it was. The locals would stare at us, then quickly look away. When we asked about the valley, they'd make excuses and leave. That's when we met Peter Wilson, our guide. He was different from the others, friendly, eager to help. He knew every trail in the valley and offered to help us navigate the tricky terrain. He seemed normal enough, but looking back, I should have noticed how his smile never quite reached his eyes. The real warnings came from Running Wolf, an elderly medicine man we met at the local diner. He grabbed my arm as we were leaving and said something I'll never forget. "The valley is hungry. It feeds on the curious. Go home while you still can." I wish we had listened. I really wish we had. But we were scientists, you see. We didn't believe in curses or ancient evil. We believed in facts, in things we could prove. So we drove our RV into Blood Moon Valley that afternoon, excited about our research. The sun was setting behind the red cliffs, casting long shadows that looked like reaching fingers. Helen said it would make a great photo. We had no idea those shadows were the least of what we'd have to fear in the coming days. That first night in the valley, that's when everything started to go wrong. But let me tell you about that tomorrow. Just remembering, it makes my hands shake, and I need to catch my breath. That first night in the valley started normally enough. Helen was setting up her camera equipment while I wrote in my research journal. Peter helped us park the RV in a flat spot near some ancient cliff dwellings. The desert sunset was beautiful, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. But around midnight, things changed. I was woken up by a strange sound, like someone walking around our RV, but the footsteps seemed wrong somehow. Too heavy, yet too quiet at the same time. Helen was still asleep, but I noticed our battery-powered lantern was flickering, even though we'd just put in new batteries. Then came the scratching. It started soft, just barely noticeable on the RV's walls. I told myself it was just branches in the wind, but there weren't any trees nearby. The scratching got louder, moving from one side of the RV to the other, like something was circling us. I wanted to look outside, but something in my gut told me not to. You know that feeling when you're alone in the dark, and you're sure something's watching you? It was like that, but 100 times worse. Helen woke up then, grabbing my arm. "Michael," she whispered, "look at the walls." In the dim light of our flickering lantern, I saw them, symbols appearing on our RV's inner walls. They looked like they were being drawn by invisible hands, glowing slightly in the dark. I recognized some from my research, ancient tribal warnings about skinwalkers and cursed lands. We tried calling Peter on our radio, but all we got was static and what sounded like distant chanting. The RV's door had somehow sealed itself shut, though I was sure I hadn't locked it. We were trapped inside until morning. When the sun finally came up, the symbols were gone. Peter acted like nothing had happened when he showed up for breakfast, but I noticed dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept either. Later that morning, we heard about the Miller twins. They were young hikers, just 19 years old, who'd gone exploring in the valley 2 days ago. Nobody had seen them since. The local sheriff was organizing a search party, and we volunteered to help. I remember Helen taking my hand and squeezing it tight. "Maybe we should leave," she said quietly. But we didn't. We couldn't. Not with those kids missing. Besides, I told myself, there had to be a logical explanation for everything. The symbols, the sounds, the sealed door. I was a scientist after all. I still wake up sometimes, remembering that first night, wishing we'd listened to Helen's instincts. Because what happened next, well, that's when things got really scary. The search for the Miller twins started early the next morning. There were about 20 of us, local police, some volunteers, Peter, Helen, and me. The sun was already hot, making the red rocks shimmer like they were underwater. We split into groups. Helen, Peter, and I took the eastern part of the valley, near where we'd seen those strange lights the night before. As we walked, I noticed something odd. Our compasses weren't working right. They kept spinning, pointing in different directions every few minutes. "That happens here sometimes," Peter said. But he wouldn't meet my eyes. "The rocks have lots of iron in them." Around noon, Helen found something that made my blood run cold. It was a camera, one of those instant Polaroid types. It belonged to the Miller twins. Their names were scratched on the bottom. But it was what we found inside that scared us. The photos showed normal hiking shots at first, the twins smiling, taking pictures of the rocks and caves. But the last 3 photos, they showed something else. Dark shapes in the background, watching. In each picture, these shapes got closer, more clear. The final photo showed one of the twins looking terrified, pointing at something behind the camera. The photo was blurry, like their hands had been shaking. That's when we heard the scream. It came from one of the caves above us. It sounded human, but not quite right. Like someone trying to copy a human scream, but not getting it exactly right. Helen grabbed my arm so tight it hurt. Peter's face went white. "We need to leave. Now." But before we could move, Running Wolf appeared out of nowhere. I still don't know how he found us. He looked at the camera in my hands and shook his head. "The skinwalkers are hunting," he said quietly. "They have been awakened. The twins. They took photos of sacred sites, disturbed things that should have been left alone." "Skinwalkers?" Helen whispered. "You mean those shape-shifting creatures from native legends?" Running Wolf nodded slowly. "Not legends, and now they know you're here too. They've marked your RV. They'll come for you next." He pulled something from his pocket, a small leather pouch filled with herbs and what looked like crushed turquoise stones. "Keep this with you. It won't stop them, but it might slow them down." The way back to our RV felt like the longest walk of my life. We kept hearing things. Footsteps behind us that stopped when we turned around, whispers in a language I didn't understand, and worst of all, that not quite right scream getting closer. When we finally reached the RV, I saw fresh scratches on the sides, 3 long marks, like giant claws had raked across the metal. That night, none of us slept. We sat in the RV, listening to the sounds outside, watching the shadows move in ways shadows shouldn't move. Running Wolf's words kept echoing in my head. "They'll come for you next." And come they did. But what happened that third night? That's when we learned what true terror really means. The third night was when Helen started acting strange. I found her standing outside the RV at 3 a.m., staring into the darkness, her camera clicking away. When I brought her back inside, she couldn't remember going out there. She just kept saying, "They were calling me, Michael. They were singing my name." I checked her camera, and what I saw made my hands shake. Every photo showed the same thing, dark figures standing in a circle around our RV. In each picture, they were closer. The last photo showed them just feet away from where Helen had been standing. Their faces, they weren't human faces. Peter came running to our RV at dawn, looking scared. "They found the Miller twins," he said, his voice shaking. But the way he said it, I knew this wasn't good news. The twins were in one of the ancient caves, arranged in a circle of those strange symbols we'd seen on our RV walls. They were alive, but different. They wouldn't speak, wouldn't blink, just stared at nothing with empty eyes. When the rescue team tried to move them, they started screaming in that same not-quite-human way we'd heard before. Running Wolf arrived at the cave and took one look at the twins. His face turned gray. "They've been touched by the skinwalkers," he said. "Their spirits have been changed." That's when Peter started acting weird too. His hands were shaking, and he kept looking over his shoulder like he was expecting something to grab him. Finally, he broke down and told us the truth. "I should have warned you," he said, wiping sweat from his face. "My grandfather was a guardian here. He was supposed to protect this place, keep people away. When he died, the duty passed to me. But I failed. I let too many people in. And now they're awake." Helen grabbed her camera again, but this time when she looked through the viewfinder, she started screaming. The camera fell from her hands, and when it hit the ground, the back popped open. All the film spilled out, completely black, like it had been burned. Running Wolf pulled me aside. "Tonight is only the beginning," he warned. "The blood moon is coming in 5 days. If we don't stop this by then..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. As the sun set, we could hear howling in the distance. But it wasn't wolves. Wolves don't laugh when they howl. And wolves don't call your name in voices that sound like people you lost long ago. We huddled in the RV. Drawing protective symbols Running Wolf taught us on every window and door. But we could hear them out there, circling, scratching, waiting. And Helen kept staring out the windows and smiling, like she could see something the rest of us couldn't. That's when we realized the skinwalkers hadn't just marked our RV, they'd marked Helen, and they were coming to collect her. The 4th day started with Helen missing from the RV. My heart nearly stopped when I woke up and couldn't find her. The RV door was wide open, even though I distinctly remembered barricading it the night before. I found her footprints in the desert sand, leading towards the ancient cliff dwellings. Peter and I followed them, with Running Wolf joining us halfway. The old medicine man looked worried, more worried than I'd ever seen him. "She's being called," Running Wolf said softly. "The skinwalkers are drawing her to their sacred cave." We found Helen sitting cross-legged in front of a cave entrance, taking pictures of the walls. But when I looked at the walls, there was nothing there, just bare rock. Yet Helen kept clicking away, mumbling, "So beautiful. Can't you see them? They're dancing." Her photos showed something entirely different. In them, the walls were covered with moving shadows, twisted figures that seemed to dance and reach out towards the camera. Each photo was darker than the last, like something was slowly blocking out the light. Then Peter did something that changed everything. He walked up to the cave wall and pressed his hand against it. The rock, it rippled like water. He turned to us with tears in his eyes. "I have to tell you something," he said, his voice shaking. "I'm not just a guardian. My grandfather, he made a deal with them. Every 10 years they need. He couldn't finish, but Running Wolf did it for him. They need sacrifices, living souls. That's why the Miller twins were taken. That's why they want Helen." Suddenly, Helen stood up. Her eyes were different, completely black. When she spoke, it wasn't her voice anymore. It was like multiple voices talking at once, some deep, some high, all wrong. "The blood moon comes," she said. "The old bargain must be kept." Peter fell to his knees, crying now. "I'm sorry," he kept saying. "I'm so sorry. I thought if I brought people here, they'd take them and leave my family alone." Running Wolf grabbed my arm. "We have 4 days until the blood moon. If we don't break their power by then, Helen will be lost forever, just like the twins." As if answering him, a chorus of those not quite human screams echoed through the valley. Helen smiled, that terrible empty smile, and raised her camera for one more picture. The flash went off, and in that split second of light, I saw them, dozens of them, standing all around us. Tall, twisted figures with animal heads on human bodies, their skin shifting like smoke. And they were all staring at Helen. Running Wolf pulled out a small pouch and started chanting. The figures faded away, and Helen collapsed. We carried her back to the RV, but I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because now we knew the truth, Peter had led us here on purpose. We weren't researchers to him, we were bait. And the real horror was just beginning. The next few hours were a blur. Running Wolf started turning our RV into what he called a safe house. He burned special herbs in every corner and drew symbols on all the windows with a mixture of salt and crushed turquoise. The whole time Helen lay unconscious on the small bed, mumbling words that didn't make sense. "We need to get her out of here," I said, holding Helen's cold hand. Running Wolf shook his head. "Too late for that. They've marked her. If we try to leave now, they'll follow. The only way to save her is to break their power before the blood moon rises." Peter sat in the corner, looking like a scared child. "There might be a way," he whispered. "My grandfather, he kept journals. They're hidden in his old cabin just north of here. They might tell us how to stop this." I didn't trust Peter anymore, but we had no choice. We waited until noon. Skinwalkers are weaker in bright sunlight, Running Wolf explained. Then Peter and I headed for the cabin while Running Wolf stayed to protect Helen. The cabin was more like a shack, falling apart and half buried in sand. Inside, everything was covered in dust except for one thing, a fresh handprint on an old wooden chest. When we opened it, we found the journals, but also something else, photographs, dozens of them, showing different groups of tourists over the years. All of them had been circled in red ink. All of them had gone missing in Blood Moon Valley. "How many?" I asked Peter, my voice shaking with anger. "How many people did your family lead here?" Before he could answer, we heard it. That familiar wrong scream, but this time in broad daylight. Through the cabin's dirty window, we saw something moving in the shadows between the rocks. Something big. "Run!" Peter yelled. We grabbed the journals and ran for the RV. But halfway there, Peter tripped. I turned back to help him up, but stopped cold. His eyes had turned completely black, just like Helen's had. "I'm sorry," he said in that same many-voiced way, "but the old bargain must be kept." His skin started to ripple and change. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, clutching those journals to my chest. Behind me, I could hear something chasing me, something that wasn't Peter anymore. I made it back to the RV just as the sun was starting to set. Running Wolf pulled me inside and slammed the door. Helen was awake now, sitting up in bed, but her eyes were still all wrong. That night, we read through the journals by lantern light, looking for anything that could help us. Outside, we could hear them circling, the skinwalkers, the thing that used to be Peter, and who knows what else. They kept calling our names, using voices of people we knew, people who were dead. What we found in those journals, it was worse than we imagined. Much worse. And we only had 3 days left until the blood moon. The journals told a horrible story. 100 years ago, Peter's great-grandfather had made a deal with the skinwalkers. Every 10 years, during the blood moon, they needed 5 souls to stay powerful. In return, they would protect his family and make them rich. As I read more, my hands started shaking. The Miller twins were victims number 1 and 2. Helen was meant to be number 3. Running Wolf looked at me with sad eyes. "They still need 2 more," he said quietly. "That's why Peter led you both here." Helen sat in the corner, sometimes normal, sometimes not. When she was herself, she'd cry and hold my hand. But other times, her eyes would go black, and she'd start singing in that strange language. Around midnight, something hit our RV's roof. Thump! Then we heard scratching, like giant claws dragging across metal. A voice called down, sounding exactly like Peter. "Come out, Michael. Let's talk about this." Running Wolf pulled out an old leather book from his bag. "There might be a way," he said, "but it's dangerous. The journals mention a ceremony that can break their power, but it has to be done at their sacred cave during the blood moon." "What's the catch?" I asked, knowing there had to be one. "It needs a sacrifice," he said. "Someone has to willingly give their life to break the Skinwalker's power forever." Suddenly, Helen screamed. Not the Skinwalker scream, but her normal voice. She pointed at the window. There, pressed against the glass, was a face, but it kept changing. First it was Peter, then one of the Miller twins, then something, not human at all. Running Wolf threw some burning herbs at the window, and the face disappeared. But we could still hear them out there, walking around our RV, scratching, whispering. That's when Helen grabbed my arm. Her eyes were clear for a moment. "Michael," she said, "I remember where they took me this morning. I saw their cave. I know where it is." Running Wolf looked worried. "They're letting you remember. It's a trap." "Of course it's a trap," I said, "but it might be our only chance." We spent the rest of the night planning. We had 2 days until the blood moon. 2 days to figure out how to do this ceremony. 2 days to decide who would make the sacrifice. Outside, the Skinwalkers kept circling, kept calling. They knew we'd come to them eventually. They'd been playing this game for 100 years. But they didn't know one thing. Running Wolf had a secret, something he hadn't told us yet, something that would change everything. Running Wolf waited until dawn to tell us his secret. He rolled up his sleeve, showing us a strange mark on his arm, like a handprint burned into his skin. 50 years ago, he said quietly, "I was supposed to be one of their sacrifices, but I escaped. I've spent my whole life learning how to fight them. And now," he touched the mark, "they still want me. My soul would be worth more than any other to them." Helen was having a good moment, her eyes clear. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying," Running Wolf looked at us both, "I'm old. I've lived my life. If someone has to be sacrificed in that ceremony, it should be me." Just then, we heard a truck pulling up outside. Through the window, we saw the local sheriff. He was calling our names, asking us to come out. But something wasn't right. His movements were too stiff, like a puppet on strings. "Don't answer," Running Wolf whispered. "That's not really him anymore." We watched as more vehicles arrived. Local people we'd met in town, all moving in that same weird way. They surrounded our RV, just standing there, staring with black eyes. Helen suddenly grabbed her camera and started taking pictures. In each photo, the people outside looked different, their faces half human, half animal. They were all skinwalkers, wearing human shapes like costumes. Running Wolf started teaching us the ceremony words. We had to get them exactly right. One mistake, he said, and it wouldn't work. But as we practiced, Helen kept fading in and out. Sometimes she'd be fine. Then her eyes would go black and she'd start speaking in their voice. Night came, and the creatures outside started their tricks again. We heard my mother's voice. She died when I was 10, calling for help. Then Helen's sister, who'd passed away last year. They used the voices of everyone we'd lost, trying to make us come out. But the worst part was when we heard Peter crying like a child, begging us to help him. "Please," his voice sobbed. "I'm sorry. I'm me again. Please let me in." Running Wolf gripped my shoulder. "Tomorrow night is the blood moon. We have to reach their cave before sunset. Helen knows the way, but..." He looked at her worriedly. "Can we trust what she remembers?" Helen was curled up in the corner, shivering. When she looked up, her eyes were her own again, filled with tears. "I can fight them," she whispered. "Long enough to show you the way. I have to." That night, none of us slept. We packed what we needed for the ceremony and waited. Outside, the skinwalkers kept up their horrible show, using voices and memories to taunt us. They knew what we were planning. They were ready for us. But were we ready for them? The final day started with a blood-red sunrise. We left the RV early, carrying only what we needed for the ceremony. Running Wolf's sacred items, Helen's camera, and my backpack, with water and the journals. The possessed townspeople were gone, but we could feel eyes watching us from everywhere. Helen led the way, fighting against whatever was trying to control her. Sometimes she'd stop, shaking, her eyes flickering between normal and black. "They're trying to make me lead you the wrong way," she'd whisper, "but I won't let them." Around noon, we reached a part of the canyon I'd never seen before. The rocks here were different, darker, with strange carvings that seemed to move when you looked at them too long. The air felt heavy, like just before a storm. "Look," Helen pointed with a trembling hand. There was a cave entrance, high up in the cliff. Strange symbols were carved all around it, the same ones that had appeared on our RV walls. That's when we heard them coming. Not just from one direction, but from everywhere. Skinwalkers, wearing both animal and human shapes, emerging from behind rocks and out of shadows. Among them was Peter, but he barely looked human anymore. "The sun is setting," Running Wolf said calmly. "We need to reach that cave." They let us climb up to the cave. That's what scared me the most. They wanted us to get there. Helen kept getting worse, switching between herself and something else more often now. I had to half carry her up the rocky path. Inside the cave, it was like stepping into a nightmare. The walls were covered with those moving symbols. Old bones littered the floor. And at the center was a circle of strange black stones, each one larger than a man. "There," Running Wolf pointed. "That's where the ceremony must happen." But before we could reach it, Helen collapsed. When she opened her eyes, they were completely black. Her voice came out wrong, like many voices speaking together. "You're too late," the voices said through Helen's mouth. "The blood moon rises. She belongs to us now." Running Wolf started the ceremony anyway, chanting words from the journal. The skinwalkers moved closer, but they didn't stop him. They were smiling, terrible, wrong smiles that showed too many teeth. That's when I realized something horrible, something that changed everything. The skinwalkers wanted Running Wolf to perform the ceremony. This was their plan all along. The journals we'd found, they weren't about stopping the skinwalkers. They were about making them stronger. "Stop!" I shouted at Running Wolf. "The journals, they're wrong. Peter's grandfather didn't write them to help us. He wrote them to trick people." Running Wolf froze mid-chant. The skinwalkers were moving closer now, forming a circle around us. Helen was on her knees, fighting whatever was trying to control her. "The real ceremony," I said, remembering something I'd seen in the very back of the journal, written in different handwriting. "It's in the last pages." I pulled out the journal with shaking hands. There, in faded red ink, was a different ceremony, written by someone who'd escaped like Running Wolf had. The skinwalkers howled in anger when I started reading it. Helen suddenly stood up, her eyes clearing for a moment. She raised her camera and started taking pictures. Each flash seemed to hurt the skinwalkers. They backed away from the light, hissing. "Keep taking pictures," I yelled. "The light weakens them." Running Wolf understood now. He pulled out his pouch of herbs and turquoise, spreading them in a circle around us. I kept reading the true ceremony, my voice getting stronger with each word. The skinwalkers were angry now, really angry. Peter, or what used to be Peter, lunged at us but couldn't cross the circle Running Wolf had made. The other creatures were changing shape faster and faster, like they were losing control. "The blood moon," Running Wolf pointed up through a hole in the cave ceiling. The moon was rising, deep red like it was made of fire. Helen took one last picture before collapsing again. But this time, when she opened her eyes, they were her own. The thing inside her was being pulled out. I could actually see a dark shadow leaving her body. The skinwalkers started screaming. Not their fake human screams, but something much worse. The cave walls were shaking. Rocks were falling. Everything was chaos. Then Running Wolf did something I'll never forget. Running Wolf stepped outside our protective circle. "The ceremony needs one willing sacrifice," he said calmly. "Someone they've marked before. It has to be me." "No!" I tried to grab him, but he moved too fast. He walked straight into the crowd of skinwalkers, holding his medicine pouch high. "You wanted me 50 years ago," he shouted. "Come and get me now." The skinwalkers swarmed him, but Running Wolf didn't scream. Instead, he started glowing, actually glowing, like he had sunlight inside him. He threw his medicine pouch into the air, and it burst like a flash bomb. The cave filled with blinding light. The skinwalkers shrieked. I held Helen close and kept reading the ceremony words, my voice shaking but not stopping. Peter was the first to fall. His body just crumbled, like he was made of sand. The other skinwalkers started falling too, one by one, turning to dust. Helen's camera was going crazy, taking pictures on its own. Each flash seemed to make another skinwalker disappear. The cave walls were cracking, those strange symbols fading away. Through all the chaos, I could hear Running Wolf's voice getting weaker. "Finish it, Michael. Finish the ceremony." I read the last words just as the blood moon reached its highest point. There was a sound like thunder inside the cave. The ground shook so hard we fell down. Then, silence. Complete silence. When the dust settled, the skinwalkers were gone. All of them. Where Running Wolf had been standing was just his empty medicine pouch, smoking slightly. Helen was fully herself again, crying in my arms. Her camera had one picture left. When it developed, it showed Running Wolf in his final moments. But he was young again, smiling, surrounded by bright light. We stumbled out of the cave as the sun was rising. Below, we could see the town. Normal people were walking around, looking confused, like they'd just woken up from a long sleep. The Miller twins were found later that day, wandering in the desert. They were okay but couldn't remember anything. Most people in town couldn't remember the past few days at all. Helen and I packed up our RV and left Blood Moon Valley that same morning. We never went back. But we kept Running Wolf's last picture to remember what he did for us. Sometimes, on very quiet nights, I think I can hear his voice on the wind, still guarding against the darkness. And I know that because of his sacrifice, those ancient evils will never hunt in that valley again. It's been over 50 years since that night in Blood Moon Valley. Helen and I moved to Oregon, far from the desert. But what happened there changed us forever. Helen's photographs from that week were strange. Most of them came out completely black, like they'd been burned. But a few showed things that still give me nightmares. Shadows that shouldn't be there, faces that weren't human, and that last bright picture of Running Wolf. We tried telling people our story at first, but nobody believed us. How could they? It sounded crazy, even to us sometimes. So we kept quiet, locked the pictures away, and tried to live normal lives. But every few years, something happens that reminds us it was all real. We get letters from the Miller twins sometimes. They never remembered what happened to them, but they still have nightmares about singing in the dark. They've never gone hiking again. The town near Blood Moon Valley is different now. Nobody goes missing there anymore. The locals built a small memorial for Running Wolf, though most don't know why. They just feel like they should remember him. Helen's camera never worked right after that night. Every picture it takes shows strange shadows in the background. We finally locked it away in our attic. Last year, we got a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was Running Wolf's medicine pouch, the same one he'd thrown that night. With it was a note in handwriting I didn't recognize. "The valley is safe now. Thank you." Helen still has moments when she stares into the distance, like she's seeing something nobody else can. But she's okay. We both are. We survived. Sometimes, young people ask me about doing research in remote places. I tell them to be careful, to trust their instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And if they're ever in northern Arizona and see a valley that feels different, they should turn around and drive away. Because even though Running Wolf stopped them, even though the skinwalkers are gone, I still believe there are things out there in the dark. Things that hunt, things that change shape, things that wait. And sometimes, on very quiet nights when the moon is full and red, I think I can hear them, far away, still calling my name. My name is Joseph Walker, and I never thought I'd be writing this down. What happened to my family in the Ozark Mountains still gives me nightmares, but people need to know the truth about Howler's Creek. It all started last summer when I packed up our 1964 Airstream RV with my wife Mary and our kids Billy and Emma. I'd spent months modifying that silver bullet of an RV with all sorts of equipment, motion sensors, night vision cameras, and audio recorders. Mary thought I was crazy spending our savings on ghost hunting gear, as she called it. But I knew those dogman sightings in Arkansas were real. "Daddy, are we really going to see wolf people?" 8-year-old Billy asked from the back seat, his comic book forgotten in his lap. Emma, my 6-year-old, just hugged her stuffed wolf closer and stared out the window as the mountains grew bigger around us. "They're called dogmen, honey," I corrected him, catching Mary's eye roll in the rearview mirror. "And we're going to find proof they exist." The deeper we drove into the Ozarks, the more the roads twisted and turned. Our old radio started acting funny, catching bits of static that almost sounded like words. Even Mary noticed it, though she pretended not to. The trees got thicker, blocking out most of the sunlight, and this weird fog started creeping in around the RV. When we finally found the turnoff to Howler's Creek Valley, my hands were sweating on the steering wheel. The place looked exactly like the old-timer at the gas station described. A narrow valley with weird-shaped rocks that seemed to watch us as we drove past. What he didn't mention was the feeling you get when you enter that place. Like something old and hungry just woke up and noticed you were there. "Joe, maybe we should find somewhere else," Mary said quietly. But I pretended not to hear her. I'd waited too long for this chance. We parked the RV near some old moonshine stills from Prohibition times. While I set up our equipment, Billy and Emma went exploring nearby. But not too far, I made sure of that. That's when they found the first sign that something wasn't right. "Daddy! Daddy, come look!" Emma called out, her voice shaking a little. When I reached them, Billy was pointing at a massive oak tree. Deep in its trunk were claw marks, not like any bear or mountain lion I'd ever seen. They were huge and somehow wrong. That first evening, as the sun set behind those strange rocks, we heard it. A howl that started like a wolf's but changed into something else. Something that made my skin crawl and my children cry. That was just the beginning of our 6 days in hell. I'm writing this down now because people need to be warned. If you ever find yourself near Howler's Creek, turn around. Don't let curiosity get the better of you like it did me. Some mysteries should stay buried, and some creatures should be left alone. But if you want to know what really happened to us in those woods, and why my daughter Emma still wakes up screaming some nights, I'll tell you. Just remember, I warned you. That first night in the RV was when things started getting really strange. I'd just gotten the kids to bed in the back room, and Mary was reading by the small lamp in our fold-out bed. The fog outside had gotten so thick, I could barely see the trees through our windows. Around midnight, the radio turned itself on. At first, it was just static, but then we heard something that made both Mary and me sit straight up. Through the crackling noise came what sounded like children singing, but not in any language I knew. Mary reached over to turn it off, but before she could, the voices changed to deep growls. "Joe," Mary whispered, grabbing my arm. "The scratching." She was right. Something was scratching at the outside of our RV. Not like branches in the wind, this was deliberate, moving from one end to the other. Slow, methodical. Like someone, or something, was running their claws along our walls. I grabbed my flashlight and looked out the window, but the fog was too thick. The scratching continued, moving around to where the kids were sleeping. That's when Billy started screaming. We rushed to the back room. Emma was sitting up in her bed, hugging her stuffed wolf, but Billy wasn't in his bunk. We found him standing at the RV's back window, his eyes wide open but empty, like he was sleepwalking. "The dogs want to play," he said in a voice that didn't sound like my son at all. "They're calling us." Mary pulled him away from the window while I checked the locks again. That's when I saw them, 3 sets of glowing eyes in the fog, about 7 feet off the ground. Too high to be normal wolves. They disappeared as soon as I pointed my flashlight at them. The next morning, we found long, deep scratches all over the RV's silver sides. Mary wanted to leave right then, but I convinced her to stay. I wish I hadn't. After breakfast, while I was checking my equipment, we met Earl. He just appeared out of the woods, an old man with a wild gray beard and eyes that had seen too much. He was carrying a rifle that looked as old as he was. "You folks need to leave," he said, not even introducing himself. "Ain't safe here during the dark of the moon." "We're studying local wildlife." I tried to explain, but he cut me off. "Ain't wildlife you're dealing with?" Earl said, looking at Emma, who was drawing something in her notebook. "Your girl there knows, don't you, little one?" Emma held up her drawing. My blood ran cold. She'd drawn 3 tall, wolf-like creatures standing on 2 legs, with glowing eyes, exactly like what I'd seen in the fog. "How did you?" Mary started to ask, but Earl was already walking away. "Dark of the moon's in 4 days," he called over his shoulder. "Either you'll be gone by then, or they'll make sure you never leave." I should have listened to him. Should have packed up right then. But I didn't know then what those scratches really meant, or why Billy was sleepwalking, or what Emma's drawings were warning us about. I didn't know we were being marked, chosen. And I definitely didn't know that Earl wasn't trying to scare us away, he was trying to save our lives. The second day started out quiet, too quiet. No birds singing, no squirrels running around, nothing. Even the wind seemed afraid to blow through the trees. I spent the morning checking my cameras and audio recorders from the night before. What I found made my hands shake. The night vision cameras had caught something moving in the fog. Not clear enough to make out what it was, but big. Much bigger than a normal wolf. And the audio recordings, there were voices mixed in with the howls. They sounded like whispers, saying words I couldn't quite understand. Mary was making lunch when Emma tugged on my sleeve. "Daddy," she said quietly, "Billy's acting weird again." I found my son standing at the edge of our campsite, staring into the woods. He was humming something, the same tune we'd heard on the radio the night before. When I touched his shoulder, he jumped like he'd been shocked. "They're teaching me their song," he said, blinking like he'd just woken up. "In my dreams." That afternoon, Earl showed up again. This time, he brought an old leather book with him. His hands were shaking as he opened it. "Found this in my grandpa's things?" he said, showing us yellowed pages filled with drawings. He was the one who first saw them, back in 1902. They've been here long before that, though. The drawings showed the same creatures Emma had drawn, half-wolf, half-human things, standing in circles around what looked like ancient stones. Some of the pictures showed people changing into these creatures under a dark moon. "Every generation, they pick a family," Earl said, looking straight at Billy and Emma. "Usually ones with children. They're drawn to kids who can sense things." Mary grabbed both kids and pulled them close. "Why are you telling us this?" "Because they've marked your RV," Earl said. "Those scratches? They're not random. They're writing, old writing. Same marks are on those burial mounds up the hill." I was about to tell Earl he was crazy when we heard it. A long, low howl that made the windows of our RV rattle. But this time, it wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from underground. "There's caves under the valley," Earl said, grabbing his rifle. "Miles of them. That's where they live. Where they take..." He stopped talking suddenly, looking past us with wide eyes. We all turned to see what he was staring at. There, in broad daylight, standing between 2 trees, was something impossible. It looked like a wolf, but it was standing on 2 legs, easily 8 feet tall. Its eyes were glowing yellow, fixed right on Billy. Then it smiled at us. A horrible, human-like smile, full of sharp teeth. Mary screamed. I grabbed for my camera. Earl raised his rifle, but before any of us could do anything, it disappeared. Just vanished, like smoke in the wind. "Get your kids in the RV," Earl said, his voice shaking. "And whatever you hear, whatever you see, don't come out until sunrise." As we hurried the kids inside, I heard Earl mutter something that made my blood run cold. "They've already chosen. God help us all." That night was when the real horror began. That night was the longest of my life. We huddled together in the RV, listening to the sounds outside getting closer and closer. The fog pressed against our windows like thick soup, and shapes moved through it, tall, dark shapes that shouldn't exist. Billy started sleepwalking again around midnight. One minute he was asleep next to Emma. The next he was standing at the RV door, his hand reaching for the handle. Mary caught him just in time. "They're calling me," he said, his eyes glazed over. "They want to show me how to change." Emma started crying then, clutching her drawing book. "I can feel them too, Daddy," she whispered. "In my head. They're so hungry." That's when the scratching started again, but different this time. It wasn't just on the walls. It was under us, coming from beneath the RV, like something was trying to dig its way up to us. Mary grabbed our emergency flashlight when the RV's lights suddenly went out. In the beam, we could see fog seeping in through every crack and vent. And with it came a smell, like wet dog and something rotting. "Look," Emma pointed at the window. Written in the fog, from the inside, were words none of us had written. "Come play with us." The words disappeared as quickly as they'd appeared. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was when we heard Earl screaming outside. I wanted to help him, I really did. But Mary held me back. "Don't you dare open that door," she said through tears. "Think of the kids." Earl's screams turned into howls, then silence. The scratching stopped too. Everything went quiet except for a deep growling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then something heavy landed on our roof. Thump, thump, thump. Footsteps, moving slowly across the top of our RV. The whole ceiling creaked under the weight. Whatever was up there was big, much bigger than a person. Emma looked up and whispered, "It's the pack leader. He wants us to see him change." As if answering her, a face appeared at our skylight, a face that started as a man's but slowly, horribly changed into something else right before our eyes. The nose and mouth stretched into a snout. Teeth grew long and sharp. And those eyes, those terrible yellow eyes stared right at us as fur sprouted across its face. Billy started humming that strange tune again, and the thing at the skylight, it smiled. Then it spoke, in a voice that was half growl, half human. "Soon, little ones. When the moon dies, you'll join our pack." Mary fainted. I held my children close, watching as more shapes gathered around our RV. We were surrounded, trapped, and the dark of the moon was getting closer. And somewhere in the darkness, Earl's rifle lay empty and useless, its owner gone, taken by the things we'd come looking for but never should have found. The next morning, we found Earl's rifle in the mud, but no sign of Earl himself. Just some torn pieces of his old jacket and tracks. Huge tracks that started as human footprints and slowly changed into something else, leading toward the hills. Mary was throwing everything into our bags, ready to run, when Emma stopped us. "We can't leave," she said in a small voice. "They won't let us, not until the dark moon." She was right. The RV wouldn't start. I tried everything I knew about engines, but nothing worked. We were stuck. That's when we heard someone walking through the woods. But it wasn't Earl. It was a teenage boy and girl carrying backpacks. "Hey," I shouted, waving them over. "You need to get out of here. It's not safe." But before they could answer, the fog rolled in, thick and fast, in the middle of a sunny day. The teenagers disappeared in it. We heard screams, then those horrible howls again. When the fog cleared a few minutes later, there was nothing left but 2 torn backpacks. Billy walked over and picked something up from the ground. It was a necklace, still warm. "They're taking them to the den," he said in that strange, faraway voice. "Under the burial mounds." Mary grabbed the kids and pulled them into the RV. But I had to know. I followed the tracks up the hill to the burial mounds Earl had mentioned. What I found there changed everything. There was a hole, hidden behind some rocks. Not a natural cave. This was dug out, with strange carvings all around the entrance. The marks matched the scratches on our RV. I shined my flashlight inside and saw stone steps leading down. The walls were covered in paintings, ancient ones showing people turning into wolf creatures under a black moon. And at the bottom of the steps, .fr-esh claw marks and blood. Something moved in the darkness below, something big. I ran back to the RV as fast as I could. When I got back, Mary was crying. "Billy," she sobbed. I only looked away for a second. The back door of the RV was open. Billy was gone. But Emma sat calmly at the table, drawing. "They took him to prepare him," she said, showing me her picture. It showed the underground den, exactly as I'd seen it, but with more details. Tunnels spreading out like a spider web, and in the center, a big round cave with stone pillars. "That's where they do the changing," Emma said. "Where they make new pack members. They're going to change Billy first, then me." She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "Daddy, I can feel them getting ready. They're so excited." Mary grabbed our biggest flashlight like a club. "We're getting him back," she said. "Right now." But Emma shook her head. "We have to wait for the dark moon. That's when they'll all be there. That's when Earl will help us." "But Earl's gone," I said. "No," Emma replied, starting a new drawing. "Earl's changing too, but he's fighting it. He's waiting for us." She looked up at the darkening sky. "One more day, Daddy. Then we'll either save Billy or join him." The howls started again, closer this time, and somewhere in them, I heard my son's voice, calling us to come play. That last day was the hardest. We could hear Billy's voice carried on the wind, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying, calling for us to join him. Mary hadn't slept at all, her eyes red and wild, holding on to Emma like she might disappear too. Around noon, something changed. The air got heavy, like before a storm. Emma sat up straight, her eyes wide. "They're getting ready," she whispered. "The dark moon is coming tonight." Then we heard it, Earl's voice, but different now, rougher, coming from just outside our RV. "Joseph," he growled. "Bring the girl. I can show you the way in." When I looked out the window, I almost didn't recognize him. Earl's face was different, longer, his teeth showing through his lips, his eyes yellow like theirs. But there was still something human in those eyes. "You're one of them now," I said through the door. "Not completely," he answered. "Fighting it. But not for long. Listen, there's a way to stop this. In the main chamber, there's an old stone altar. That's where they do the changing, if you can destroy it before the moon dies." He doubled over suddenly, groaning as fur started sprouting on his hands. "Hurry! They're distracted now, preparing for tonight. It's your only chance to save your boy." Mary grabbed our sharpest knives and the flashlights. I took my camera bag, not for pictures now, but because I had flares in it. Emma packed her drawing book, saying she'd need it to find the way. As we stepped out of the RV, Earl was gone, but he'd left us a map scratched in the dirt, showing a different way into the caves, a secret entrance. The fog was thick as we followed Emma up the hill. She walked like she was in a trance, following something only she could sense. The entrance we found was small, hidden behind a fallen tree. We had to crawl through on our hands and knees. Inside, the tunnel went down, down, down. Our flashlight beams showed more of those strange markings on the walls. Emma touched them as we walked, reading them like she'd known them all her life. "This way," she whispered. "I can hear Billy, and others, children they took before." The tunnel opened into a bigger cave. That's when we saw the first changed ones, not fully wolf, not fully human, sleeping in groups against the walls. We crept past them, holding our breath. Then we heard Billy's voice clear as day. "Mommy? Daddy? I can smell you." But it wasn't Billy's voice anymore. Not really. It had that same growl that Earl's had. Emma squeezed my hand. "The altar chamber is just ahead," she whispered. "But Daddy, they're all waiting for us. They knew we'd come." As if to prove her right, yellow eyes started opening in the darkness all around us. And from deeper in the cave came a sound that made our bones shake, the Alpha's howl, calling his pack to feast. We were trapped, deep underground, surrounded by monsters. and the dark moon was rising. Everything happened so fast after that. The pack emerged from the shadows, dozens of them, in different stages of change. Some looked almost human, others were more wolf than man. They formed a circle around us, herding us toward the main chamber. The chamber was huge, like a natural cathedral underground. Moonlight filtered through cracks in the ceiling, lighting up the stone altar in the center. It was covered in those same strange markings that were on our RV. And there was Billy, standing next to the altar. My little boy's face was already changing, fur sprouting on his cheeks, his eyes glowing yellow in the dark. Next to him stood the Alpha, massive and terrifying, fully transformed now. "Your family is finally together," the Alpha spoke, his voice like gravel. "The pack has chosen you all." Mary screamed and rushed forward, but two of the pack grabbed her. I tried to reach for my flares, but they were too quick. Only Emma stood calm, still holding her drawing book. That's when Earl burst in from a side tunnel. He was halfway between man and wolf now, but fighting it hard. "The altar," he growled. "Break it now." Everything exploded into chaos. Earl launched himself at the Alpha, giving me just enough time to grab a flare. Mary broke free and ran to Billy, while the pack howled and charged. I lit the flare and threw it at the altar, but nothing happened. Emma suddenly opened her drawing book and started tearing out pages, throwing them at the stone. "The drawings!" she shouted. "They're the opposite of their marks. Quick, Daddy!" Somehow, I understood. I grabbed more flares, lighting them while Emma threw her drawings. Where her pages touched the altar, the stone began to crack. The Alpha roared, "Stop them!" But Earl was holding him back. Mary had reached Billy and was holding him tight, even as he snapped and growled. Then we heard it, a deep rumbling from above. The dark moon was directly overhead, shining through the ceiling cracks. The Alpha threw Earl aside and leaped toward us, but he was too late. Emma threw her last drawing. One of our family, all human, all together. When it touched the altar, everything went white. The stone split with a sound like thunder. A blast of energy knocked everyone down. When my eyes cleared, the pack was howling, not in hunger now, but in pain. They were changing back, all of them, the wolf parts melting away. Billy was in Mary's arms, normal again, crying. The Alpha was gone, just a pile of smoking fur on the ground. And Earl. Earl was human again too, but barely breathing. "Get out," he whispered. "The cave's collapsing." He was right. The ceiling was coming down. We ran, all of us, following Emma as she led us through the tunnels. Behind us, we could hear the caves falling in, burying the altar chamber forever. We made it out just as the sun was rising. Our RV started on the first try, and we drove away from Howler's Creek as fast as we could. In the back seat, Billy was asleep in Mary's arms, looking like nothing had ever happened. But Emma was still drawing. This time, she drew Earl, standing guard at the cave entrance, keeping watch, making sure those things never came back. "He stayed behind on purpose," she said softly, "to make sure it ended." We never went back to Howler's Creek. The local papers reported a cave-in that sealed off most of the valley. They never found Earl's body or any trace of the pack. But sometimes, on dark nights, Billy and Emma still hum that strange tune in their sleep. And sometimes, when I look at their eyes in certain light, I catch just a hint of yellow. Just enough to remind me that some stories don't completely end. They just go quiet for a while, waiting in the dark. My name is Richard Matthews, but everyone calls me Dick. I never thought I'd be telling this story, but what happened in the Olympic National Forest changed my life forever. It's been 3 years since those 7 days in the misty woods with my son Kyle, and I still wake up in cold sweats thinking about it. I used to work for the Forestry Service until my divorce hit me hard. 15 years of marriage down the drain, and my teenage son Kyle barely wanted to talk to me anymore. I thought a camping trip might fix things between us, You know, one of those father-son bonding moments you see in the movies. Man, was I wrong about how this trip would turn out? It all started when I bought this used RV, a 1987 Fleetwood Bounder. Got it for a steal from some estate sale. The previous owner was a researcher who went missing in these same woods, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Should have known something was off when the moss kept growing back no matter how many times I cleaned it. Kyle wasn't happy about the trip. "Dad, I could be gaming with my friends," he complained the whole drive up. He was 15, all attitude and rolled eyes, buried in his phone until we lost signal halfway up the mountain road. The mist was already rolling in when we pulled into our campsite, even though it was only mid-afternoon. The first weird thing I noticed was the compass on the RV's dashboard. It kept spinning in circles, which made no sense. Then, there was this strange fog that kept forming on the inside of the windows, even with the heat on. But hey, I figured it was just the old RV acting up. Old vehicles have their quirks, right? That first evening, as we set up camp, I caught Kyle taking pictures of the forest with his new camera, a peace offering from me for his birthday. He seemed interested in these old rock carvings he found near our campsite. For a moment, I saw a glimpse of the curious kid he used to be, before the divorce changed everything. Little did I know, those pictures would be the beginning of our nightmare. If I had known what was hiding in that mist, I would have turned that RV around and never looked back. But you can't change the past, can you? All I can do now is tell you what really happened in those woods, and why my son will never be the same again. That first night in the RV was when things started feeling different. Kyle had gone to bed early, still mad at me for taking away his phone, no signal anyway. So what was the point? I sat at the small kitchen table, looking through the photos he'd taken on his camera. That's when I saw it. In one of the pictures of the rock carvings, there was something in the background, a tall, dark shape standing between two trees. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but when I zoomed in, the shape looked almost human-like, but way too tall. My hands started shaking a bit, but I told myself it was probably just a trick of the light. Around midnight, the first knocks came. 3 loud bangs on the side of the RV, like someone hitting it with a stick. Thump, thump. "Kyle," I called out, thinking maybe he was playing a prank, but I could hear his soft snoring from the back bedroom. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The mist was so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead. The beam of my flashlight just bounced back at me, like the mist was some kind of wall. That's when I noticed how quiet it was. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Just dead silence. The next morning, while making breakfast, we had our first visitor. An old Native American man walked right up to our campsite like he'd been invited. He introduced himself simply as Old Tom and stared at our RV for a long time before speaking. "That researcher's RV," he said, not really asking. "The one who went missing last spring." Kyle, who usually ignored everyone, actually looked up from his cereal. "You shouldn't be here," Old Tom said quietly. "The tall ones, they've been more active lately, especially since the Henderson family set up camp down by the stone circle." "The tall ones?" Kyle asked, suddenly interested. Old Tom's face got real serious. "Some things in these woods, they're not what you think they are. They're not what anyone thinks they are. If you hear knocking at night, don't answer. If you see lights in the mist, don't follow them. And whatever you do, don't take pictures of the shadows." He looked straight at Kyle when he said that last part, and my stomach did a flip as I remembered the strange shape in yesterday's photo. Before leaving, Old Tom turned back one last time. "That moss on your RV? It's not normal moss, it's a mark. They're already watching you." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but he disappeared into the mist as quickly as he had appeared. Kyle and I just sat there, our breakfast getting cold, both thinking about those knocks in the night. I should have listened to Old Tom, should have packed up right then and driven away. But I didn't. And that's when our real troubles began. That afternoon, Kyle and I decided to walk down to check out the Henderson family's campsite. I'd met them briefly at the ranger station, Nice family with 2 kids, Sarah and Tommy, probably around 8 and 10 years old. But when we got there, something felt wrong right away. Their tent was still up, sleeping bags inside. A pot of half-cooked soup sat on their camping stove like they'd just stepped away in the middle of making dinner. Their car was still parked nearby, but there was no sign of any of them. "Dad?" Kyle's voice shook a little. "Look at this." He was pointing at something in the dirt. At first, I thought it was a bear track. We get plenty of those in these woods. But this was different. It looked like a human footprint, but huge, maybe twice the size of my boot, and it had 6 toes. That's when we heard someone calling through the mist. A woman in a ranger uniform appeared, Diane Porter, according to her name tag. She looked worried. "Mr. Matthews? I was just coming to check on you folks," she said. Then saw the empty campsite. Her face went pale. "Oh no, not again." "Again?" I asked. Diane ran her hand through her hair, looking troubled. "We've had incidents. People going missing. Always when the mist is thick like this." Kyle suddenly grabbed his nose. Blood was dripping from it. It came out of nowhere, and he'd never had nosebleeds before. As I helped him clean up, I noticed his hands were ice cold. "You need to come with me," Diane said firmly. "Both of you. We need to report this, and there are things you should know." On our way back to the ranger station, we heard it. Wood knocks echoing through the trees. But this time it wasn't just 3 knocks. It was like a conversation, coming from all around us. Thump, thump. Pause. Thump, thump, thump. Another pause. Thump. Kyle grabbed my arm. "Dad," he whispered, pointing into the mist. I saw them too, dark shapes moving in the fog, tall and silent. They seemed to glide rather than walk. I counted at least 3 of them, but there could have been more. Diane saw them too. She pulled out her radio, but all we heard was static and a strange, deep humming sound. "Run," she said quietly. "Back to your RV. Now." We ran through the mist, the shapes always just at the edge of our vision. When we finally made it back to the RV, that strange moss had spread, now covering almost half of one side. And on Kyle's camera, which he'd left on the table, every single picture had those tall shadows in the background now, even the ones that didn't have them before. Back in the RV, Diane showed us a folder full of old newspaper clippings. People had been vanishing in these woods for years. Hikers, campers, even park rangers. Always during heavy mist, always near the stone circles. Kyle's nosebleeds kept getting worse, and he said he felt weird, like he wasn't fully here. "There's something else," Diane said, pulling out an old photo. It showed the same 6-toed footprint we'd found, but this one was from 1962. They've always been here. We just pretend they're not. That's when old Tom showed up again, appearing out of nowhere and knocking on our RV door. His face looked scared, something I never expected to see from him. "The boy," he said, looking at Kyle, "he's been marked. I can sense it. They're trying to take him to the other side." "What other side?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The place where the tall ones come from. They're not just creatures in our woods. They're travelers. They move between worlds through the mist. And they want your son." Kyle was sitting at the table, shivering despite the heater being on full blast. The windows were fogging up again, but this time we could see handprints appearing in the fog. Huge handprints from the outside, pressing in. "We need to perform a protection ritual," old Tom said. "Tonight, before the moon rises, it's the only way to keep them from taking him." Diane looked skeptical but scared. "I've worked these woods for 12 years, she said. "I've seen things I can't explain. Maybe we should listen to him." The knocking started again, louder this time. Thump, thump. The whole RV shook. "They're getting closer," old Tom whispered. "They know we're trying to stop them." I looked at Kyle, my son, who seemed to be getting paler by the minute. The moss on the RV had now spread to the roof, and the compass was spinning so fast it looked like it might break. "What do we need for this ritual?" I asked old Tom. But before he could answer, all the lights in the RV went out. In the sudden darkness, we could hear something huge walking around outside, its footsteps making the ground tremble. And then, through the foggy windows, we saw them, tall, dark figures surrounding our RV, their heads almost as high as the roof. Kyle started screaming, blood pouring from his nose again, and that's when things went from scary to impossible. The RV started to feel strange, like we were floating. Through the windows, the mist turned a weird purple color, and I could see what looked like tears in the air, like someone had taken scissors to reality itself. Kyle's eyes were glowing slightly, and he kept fading in and out like a bad television signal. The ritual, old Tom said quickly, pulling things from his bag. We need to do it now. He laid out some herbs, crystals, and an old drum on the RV's small table. But before he could start, Diane suddenly grabbed her head and screamed. They're talking to me, she gasped. In my head, they're showing me things, other worlds. She stumbled toward the door. I tried to grab her, but it was like trying to hold smoke. She walked right through the RV wall, not breaking it, but passing through it like it wasn't there. Then she was gone, swallowed by the purple mist. Dad! Kyle's voice sounded far away, even though he was right next to me. I can see them clearly now. They're beautiful and terrible at the same time. They want to show me something. Old Tom started chanting and beating his drum. The sound seemed to make the tall figures outside angry. They started hitting the RV harder, making dents appear in the metal walls. The boy is halfway between worlds now, old Tom said between chants. They marked him because he's special. He can see both sides. They want him as a bridge between their world and ours. I watched in horror as Kyle's body started to fade more and more. Sometimes I could see right through him, like he was made of glass. The nosebleed had stopped, but now his tears were leaving glowing marks on his cheeks. There's only one way to save him, old Tom said, his voice heavy. Someone has to take his place. A willing sacrifice. The tall figures outside went quiet. Through the window, I could see them waiting, watching. They knew what was happening. I'll do it, I said without hesitation. He's my son. Old Tom nodded sadly. Once it's done, you can't come back. You'll belong to their world. Kyle became solid again for a moment. Dad, no, he cried, trying to reach for me. But his hands passed right through my arms. The drumming got louder, and old Tom's chanting turned into something that made my ears hurt. The purple mist started seeping into the RV, and with it came knowledge. Terrible, wonderful knowledge about what these beings really were and where they came from. I looked at my son one last time, memorizing his face. I love you, Kyle, I said. Tell your mom I'm sorry. Then I stepped toward the door, ready to make the biggest sacrifice of my life. The moment I opened the RV door, everything changed. The tall figures moved closer, their shapes clearer now. They weren't exactly Bigfoot like people describe. They were something else, something older. Their bodies seemed to shift between solid and misty, and their eyes. Their eyes held entire universes in them. Old Tom's drumming reached a fever pitch. Richard, he shouted, once you step out, look only at them. Don't look back at Kyle no matter what you hear. I took a deep breath and stepped into the purple mist. It felt like walking into cold water. The tall figures circled around me, and I could feel them in my head, showing me images of their world, a place where the laws of nature worked differently, where time flowed like water and space bent like rubber. Behind me, Kyle screamed, "Dad, please, don't go!" It took everything I had not to turn around. My heart was breaking, but I kept walking toward the tallest figure. I could hear Kyle sobbing, becoming more solid with each step I took away from him. Then old Tom started screaming too. I heard a crash inside the RV. Against my better judgment, I glanced back for just a second. Old Tom was on the floor. His eyes rolled back, the drum split in half. The ritual was killing him. The price must be paid. The tallest figure spoke in my head. Its voice felt like thunder and whispers all at once. A life for a life. The old one offers himself as well. 2 sacrifices. The boy goes free. Everything happened so fast after that. The purple mist swirled around me like a tornado. I felt myself being pulled apart and put back together. The last thing I saw was Kyle, solid again, holding on to old Tom's lifeless body, his face streaked with tears, but no longer glowing. Then the world shifted. I was somewhere else, somewhere impossible. Diane was there too, but she looked different now, like she belonged here. She smiled at me sadly and took my hand. "Welcome," she said, "to the other side." Back in our world, Kyle told the Rangers he found old Tom dead from a heart attack. The Henderson family was never found. The moss on the RV disappeared, and the compass started working again. Kyle went home to his mom, changed forever but alive. Sometimes, when the mist gets thick in the Olympic forest, hikers say they see a tall figure walking with the others, looking back toward our world. They say it seems sad, like it lost something precious. And sometimes, on very quiet nights, you can hear 3 knocks, followed by a father's whispered, "I love you." That's my story. I'm telling it now from the other side, through ways I've learned to reach back. If you're ever in those woods and see the mist turning purple, run. Run as fast as you can. Unless, like me, you have something worth sacrificing everything for. Because the tall ones are still there, still watching, still waiting for special people like Kyle. And now, I'm one of them, forever walking in the mist, protecting others from the fate I chose for myself.